So let's talk about how game talks to the sound file, because sound demonstrates both ways of using modules. So as I said here in main, I require game. Game returns this table which I created. Attached to that table is the function init, which I then call line 67 of main. It then executes all of this code, starts up physics, creates some rendering layers, initializes some of the other modules, and then it talks to the sound module. And what it does is it initializes the sound module, and if we go look at sound.lua, which is in the scripts file, we'll see that the sound module loads the requires audio. It sets up a table called sound. It creates another table called effects. Then it uses my shorthand notation to set up an event listener for an event called onSFX. I'll come back to it in a minute. It has the init function. The init function will fill in some sound effects. If you recall from our sound effects folder, we had click and explosion. It uses the audio load sound function to load that sound into memory, get it ready for using. This function itself will return a handle, a variable in a sense that we can use later to reference that sound. I store it in my effects table, and the only other function is left in this is the play soundtrack, which we won't talk about today. Actually, I'm going to have to. Okay, so we go back to game. At this point, it's been initialized. I'll comment out the start. We'll see what we get in the console when this executes. I know, you're probably looking at the clock. We're getting ready to run over.
No, that's fine.
Okay, so when you can't see anything happening on the screen, but I will press Control-R, which is reload for the Windows simulator. We'll see some stuff print out here. What we'll see is it says Initializing Game Module. That's this line right here. And a little bit further down, it's going to create some layers. We'll see that it prints out creating render layers, which if we were to go open the layers module, we would see that the creation code prints that out. And then it initializes one touch, player, and wall, and they all have similar statements in them. So we see initializing one touch, initializing player, and initializing wall. The sound file doesn't have any output. It doesn't print anything out to the console, so we don't see a message from this one. But at this point, sound is ready to use. So let's go ahead and re-enable over in main.lua the start. So that's this function in the game module. See that I have a bunch of stuff commented out here. So I'm going to uncomment the first one. Now, when this runs, it's going to come in here, can ignore the first couple of lines. It's going to call the function play soundtrack out of the sound module. If we go look at that, we'll see that this is the function. What it does is it loads, at that very moment, it loads the soundtrack file, whatever it may be, that we pass to it. Get these side by side so you can see them, which is unique track something something. That's so technical. It loads it up, as I said before. We get a handle, and then uses the audio play function to play that sound. Plays it on channel 1. It says to loop it infinitely because our soundtrack will pretty much just play in the background forever and ever. And when it first starts, it will take 3 seconds to fade in. So this is a direct call to the module. We're basically required the module into a game, and we are directly calling in to do something with it. So let's go ahead and run the code and see, make sure I saved everything. I don't know if you'll be able to hear this.
No. It's not coming through on this end.
Okay. So
but I'm assuming soundtrack.
Hard to show audio in a video. Okay. Darn it. That's terrible. Okay. Well, people run this. Do what I'm doing here. go into the game module in this next step. And what this one's going to do is it's going to create a loop where it's going to call timer perform with delay. It's going to have a 1 second delay plus 100 times the loop counter. So at 1,100, 1,200, etc., it's going to call this function here. I know this is kind of advanced, but we've talked about this stuff before. This is a closure. Then it's going to call my post function. So long story short, what I'm doing is I am posting 5 calls to the on sound effects, on SFX listener. And if you could hear it, when I reload here, you'd hear a delay, nothing, and then you'd hear click, 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 click. And then at 2 seconds, you'd hear the explosion sound.
I think it's much better this way.
Or you could hear me make the sound effects.
I heard the sound effect that time.
Yeah.
Okay. If you uncomment that code, Ed will come over to your house and make noises.
That's okay. We've got a recording of that. That's now going in my next game.
So what I've demonstrated here, and we will come back and recover this because it is a little bit confusing at first. What I've demonstrated is how to call functions directly from a module and how to set up a global event listener, which then anywhere I wanted to write this line of code, it would execute, and the bit of code over here listening for that sound effects code would hear it, it would see the event, and it would do the right thing. It would play the sound effects that I've specified. I just want to close with, why do I do this? 2 reasons. 1, there are always cases where 2 modules need to talk to each other, but there's no good direct way to do it. So your way of handling that is by using events. 2, I like to keep my code as separated as possible, because if you'll recall, I said earlier, I like to repurpose my code. One bit of code that you could take from this example and repurpose right away would be sound.lua. This is a standalone audio module at this point. You could drop this in any project where you are using SSK, and it would immediately function as long as you had the sound files there. You could just execute it, load sound.lua once, it would initialize, and then you could post your sound effects and it would play, and then you'd be done. It's very simple to implement.
It seems like this would be definitely be a good way to minimize the amount of noise in your game logic.
No pun intended.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, because then you can just look at like how things are flowing as opposed to all the code that goes into making it work. Which, you know, if you look on the right-hand side of your screen there wasn't like a ton of code, right?
It's extremely, yeah. It's very tight code.
Yeah.
1 line of code to produce a sound effect. I don't have to require the file in that where I'm using it. All I have to do is just post the event. Or for people who insist on using the runtime event, dispatch the event. So they're 2 bits of code that live somewhere else from each other. They're completely ignorant of each other, and yet they're connected through the event system.